Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Zoe Strecker, and I'm an art professor here at Transylvania. This lecture by our guest, Aubrey Streit Krug, is the last public event in a year-long series I've hosted in connection with my Bingham Young professorship. And the project is called Crucial Terrain: Ecological Flourishing, Environmental Justice, and Regenerative Culture in the Face of the Climate Crisis. There will be a whole new slate of events during the next academic year that also help us address this most crucial issue from within our context of a liberal arts community. And all of the events will again be free and open to the public. The website, the schedule, all of those things will continue to be linked to the academic dean's page at Transylvania's website under programming. And you're welcome also always to contact me directly. I'm easy to find on Transy's website, zstrecker@transy.edu. Tonight, I am just very pleased and honored to have Dr. Aubrey Streit Krug with us. Before we begin, though, I want to point out a couple of things. One is that we do have live captioning. There's a live transcript button at the bottom of your screen you can just click on. And also, we will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And you're invited to use the Q&A box. Again, that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do that anytime during the evening as you have a question or comment. And then we will address those, as many as we can, at the end. So feel free to jump into that, like I said, anytime during the presentation. Aubrey Streit Krug is a writer and teacher and researcher who studies human and plant relationships. She's the director of Ecosphere Studies at the Land Institute, where she leads a perennial grain agriculture civic science research project series. She holds a PhD in English and Great Plains Studies from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And her most recent collaborative research has been published in the journals Plants, People, Planet and Frontiers in Plant Science. Streit Krug grew up in a small town in Kansas where her parents actually farm wheat. She notes in her bio that she especially loves rocky prairie hillsides, and I imagine she does. And I'm so pleased to have her with us this evening, so please join me in your private spaces there in welcoming Aubrey Streit Krug. Welcome, Aubrey.
Thanks so much, Zoe, and thanks everyone for being here on a beautiful May evening to talk and learn together. I'm really humbled to be the narrator of this story tonight and to share some of the story of my own learning. So I'm gonna share some slides for us to look at as I talk about realizing roots, perennial grain ag and culture in a time of climate change. Now, some of you may be familiar with this Roots banner if you've engaged with the Land Institute where I work before or browsed our website or things like that. This is often unfurled at talks and hung at the Land Institute. It's a 20-foot long banner, so you're seeing the small version on your screen here. And what you're seeing at the top is annual wheat, the plant that, as Zoe mentioned, my family farms and that, like many of you, I've consumed already today, a staple grain here in the world for millennia. And the plant at the bottom is Thinopyrum intermedium, intermediate wheatgrass, which the Land Institute and collaborators are domesticating to grow Kernza perennial grain. So the scale of the banner in person is humbling. And the contrast between these roots is also pretty striking. The texture of the roots is something I like to look at and lean into and think about. And you can see some of this visual imagery echoed in the Land Institute's logo, that kind of above ground. You can see the landscape and the above ground part plants that are feeding us, and then those roots that stretch below. And what I hope we can do over the next 45 minutes or so is fill in some of the context of what's not pictured here. So these two plants were grown in order to be photographed. So grown, excavated, cleaned, and laid out to be photographed against this, this black background. But some really important things that are at the heart of our work are pictured here, namely the soil and the context in which the plants grow on land, and the people who these plants are tended by and feeding. So I wanted, though, to take advantage of the power of this banner just to call our attention to this metaphor and the materiality of roots. So roots clearly have a material impact in the world, and we're going to talk about that and talk about why they matter to the Land Institute's work and to hopefully the future of agriculture. And they also have really important cultural implications. In the language we're speaking, English, many metaphors are constructed around roots, maybe in ways that are pretty common sense to us. So the idea of getting to the root of the problem or the root of a word, the word radical, comes from the same root word as this idea of these plant roots. And so when we think about roots, we think about getting down into something. And then we think about pulling it up, so getting to the root, pulling a weed up by the roots, or we think about putting down roots, another metaphorical phrase that's about settling in a place and feeling a sense of belonging. And as we'll talk about, that might involve disrupting other human communities' roots in that place. We also have language around growing something from the root, or growing back from the root. So thinking about regeneration after above ground disturbance in the case of a plant. These perennial plants, like the plant on the bottom, can be grazed or burned at the top, but because of those living roots underground, they can grow back. So we can think about roots in terms of depth, and we can also think about them horizontally in terms of spread and connectivity. And all those factors of the language of roots are what I hope to touch on as we talk about both ag and culture tonight. So I wanted first just to situate us where we are and where I am coming to you in Kentucky from. I'm here in central Kansas. This is a photo that shows the Wahab Prairie overlook. So this is a little tiny mixed grass remnant prairie here that's overlooking research plots, and then the Smoky Hill River Valley and riparian area. So where you see that tree line along the horizon is the river coming up there. And this is a perennial and diverse ecosystem. It's also a research ecosystem. So here we're in Kaw, Pawnee, and Osage and more indigenous communities' homelands, whose ancestors were farming and growing gardens in these river bottomlands. And what we're seeing are some old roots in a perennial ecosystem that has been evolving for millennia in the case of this prairie. We're also seeing roots of persistence and then the roots of food systems in these research plots. And we're seeing everything above ground. So again, with a nod to the below ground, I want to fill in some of that context, which we can think about as ecosphere. So that part of my job title, this idea of where we are as humans in the ecosphere, what we mean by that is this mesh of life in which humans are interdependent. So rather than separating out the non-living atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, pedosphere from the living biosphere, ecosphere is a way of integrating and recognizing the interdependence of those spheres. In this case, that sphere, a mantle of life on our planet, certainly involves what's below ground here, the soils, the roots, the rocks, the microbes, all the insects that we can't see, this mesh of watershed, tracks of migration, all kinds of things happening, and that liveliness of place. So that is where I'm situated at the moment. And the Land Institute was founded in this place back in 1976, co-founded by Wes and Dana Jackson. And this book was published by Wes in 1980, New Roots for Agriculture. So this was a first document that gave a beautiful picture of both the above and below ground images and used this idea of rootedness to put forth a vision for perennial polycultures, so perennial and diverse systems. And in it, Wes writes about a vision of 2030 in which humans have made the transition from fossil fuels to the solar era, and in which they live in more and there's certainly continuity in our organizational history. And in his writing in this book, Wes was really focusing on a very small scale. He was writing about, in his vision, one kind of what he called the utopian farm and a nearby solar village. But like I said, there are these themes of familiarity, and the Land Institute's larger vision still features human communities that practice learning across generations, that are embedded in a landscape, features perennial polycultures, including perennial grains, that involves the reintegration of animals into native ecosystems, and in which soil loss and erosion is reduced to replacement levels. So the afterword to this book and second edition was written in the year that I was born. So this I feel a particular tie to, just thinking about the way my story begins to intersect with the work of the Land Institute that predates me. And we can fast forward here to now 2022. And this vision of a 2030 seems perilously close, and we're really being confronted with what's going to happen with our planet in this decade and the urgency of now, as well as this much longer term view that the Land Institute brings to our work when we think about the evolution of agriculture over millennia and the sustaining of agriculture over years to come. So when we think about that bigger picture, I like to frame it in, following the way that Kate Rayworth does in her work, Donut Economics, in which she draws upon Rockstrom and Steffen's work around planetary boundaries. So you can see that in the sort of ecological ceiling pieces, the planetary boundaries that we are crossing as humanity in terms of particularly agriculture. When we think about agriculture's impact on things like climate change, on biodiversity loss through land use and land cover change in terms of water, nitrogen, and chemicals. So agriculture has a lot to do with the way that we're exceeding the boundaries of the planet. And we also, I think, really appreciate and have to base our work on this social foundation, what we're aiming towards, and the values that hold up the way that we envision that future. So in between is the donut, a safe and just space for humanity. And this is really an illustration of the persistent why of the Land Institute's work and mission, really reconciling the difference between the natural economy and the human economy, and bringing us to live within the donut, come back down to earth, back into context, and put down roots there that can sustain us. So this sort of agricultural history is personal to me as well. And I wanted to share just a few images for my own learning journey around that. This is the wheat field, a wheat field from my family's farm in Kansas here. And this landscape is one that has had an enormous impact upon my kind of sense of what is common sense. I look at this wheat field in the middle of grain harvest. You can see there's grain still to be cut over the horizon. We're looking south here, as well as these beautiful rows of harvested grain. And I look at that as beautiful, and I was really enculturated to understand this as natural and normal. This is the way of engaging with the landscape that made possible not only my family's livelihood, but my town's and the larger community of which I was a part. And so I almost thought of this as inevitable. This is how things had to be, this domestication relationship we have with this particular grain plant that has persisted for so long and that has moved and traveled across the world in creating the agricultural economy that features these annual grains. But in my education, but also in my life, I had other opportunities to see other landscapes, including the landscape that predates the conversion of the prairie here into that annual grain cropland. So this is a mixed grass prairie remnant my family also has, in which we use as pasture for cattle. And the visual contrast between these two landscapes is so striking. And if you were in them, the the way that you would feel the texture and smell them is really different too, because this image was taken not too far into the summer, early June, in which you can see all this milkweed in bloom, and the scent is pretty gorgeous. So this sort of perennial and diverse prairie, which features these long-lived perennial plants growing in diverse mixtures. There's lots of grasses, there's forbs, there's even a course of cedar tree right there by the pond, is really different than the monoculture here of wheat that lives for a single growing season. And that sort of sense of the natural system as comparison and measure is important when we think about imagining alternative, more sustainable ways of farming. And it's also part of my story of being able to engage with the Great Plains. I went to graduate school really looking in particular first at agricultural systems that were part of communities like mine, rural settler farming communities, and the stories connected with them. That really expanded in my research to dive into and understand the agricultural histories that far predate the conversion of most of the landscape into grain fields, and to think about indigenous systems of agriculture that continue and persist, and also to think more broadly about how humans relate to plants, and to study ethnobotany and to layer on parts of this landscape that I was not able to see before. So this experience in graduate school of really understanding and investigating the relationship between stories and literature and metaphors and the ways that humans relate to plants and plant ecology has been a driving force for my research. And this is what led me to come to the Land Institute to join this interdisciplinary program and to actually build it. And I just want to name this prairie as a kind of threshold for me. And I'm going to come back to that term later, an entry point into my learning, and one that I didn't just enter one time, but that I came back to over and over, the same way that the Wahab Prairie that I showed earlier, I come back to over and over most days here at the Land Institute. So this opened up possibilities, troubling possibilities, but important questions for me as a relative newcomer culturally to this landscape. How can I learn from this place? How can I learn to care? How can I learn to repair? Could I grapple with some of my own roots as, you know, the descendant of folks who came from Germany in the late 19th century to farm this landscape? Do I grapple with those roots and also grapple with the way that I benefited from the uprooting of other peoples in this place? And what does that mean for my actions now? So that context is part of what I bring to this work. And I'm also deeply connected to this understanding of grains. And this is part of the Land Institute's work as well, that grains really do matter. You can see some of those differences in the root systems between perennial and annual plants there in the image at the left. And here at the right, you can see an image of a perennial grain crop-in process. And grains are staple foods, these hard, dry, edible seeds that can be threshed and stored and distributed. And grain crops supply the majority of human calories directly and indirectly, and cover the majority of Earth's arable agricultural land. So ecologically, they have a big impact. And that's led the Land Institute to focus on working on perennial versions of grain crops. So we're developing these perennial grain crops, and I'll talk more about that. And we're doing that so they can be grown in more diverse ecological cropping systems. And we do that in order to equitably nourish just and caring human communities, and hopefully help ensure the longevity of those communities within the ecosphere, within that planetary context. So I like to think about this in a framework of doing science work, doing community work, and building stories. And so as I talk some about the projects that I'm involved in, these themes will come up and reoccur a little bit in our work. So first, with the plant breeding work, we have several different types of programs, all aimed at creating these novel perennial grain crops. So some of these efforts are domestication efforts, where we take a wild perennial plant, something that's already perennial, and we domesticate it. We make selections to improve characteristics that make it more like a crop and more usable. That might have to do with yield, that might have to do with height, that might have to do with the way that seeds thresh freely or don't shatter. And so some of these programs involve working with intermediate wheatgrass, Kernza perennial grain that I mentioned earlier, also working with Silphium Integrifolium as a future perennial oilseed crop, and I'll also speak more about Silphium later. And then working with perennial legumes, including the beautiful pink flower plant that you see here, sainfoin, which is already grown as a forage crop in the United States, and we're interested in domesticating as a pulse crop. And then we will also work on programs that are aimed at perennialization. So taking an existing annual grain crops that we all know and eat, wheat, sorghum, or milo, rice, and then crossing those with their wild perennial relatives in order to bring perennialization into that crop line that already exists and is high yielding. So these efforts are also happening. You can see our sorghum breeder in the field there, and we also work with partners in China who have been working with great success on perennial rice. So there are lots of benefits ecologically to perennials. We think we base that based upon all of the perennial ecosystems that are natural and healthy around the world and that have been studied to a great extent. But of course, we are still developing perennial grains and cropping systems. So we are researching how to create cropping systems that realize these ecological benefits of wild perennial plants. And our suite of programs here involves work in soil ecology and crop protection ecology, and working with plant pathogens and diseases as well. So we know that the ability of agricultural practices like landscape perennialization is significant, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in the context of climate change. But we also know that it's not sufficient to solve the problem of climate change alone. It's not sufficient to be able to cancel out the emissions that we have from burning fossil fuels at the rate in which we are. So that must be addressed when we talk about this larger context of climate change. At the same time, it's possible to make an impact when we think about perennialization and converting annual croplands to perennial grain systems, including perennial grains that can be used for dual purposes, feeding, grazing livestock, and also harvesting grains for feeding humans directly, can be a really powerful solution. So the Land Institute and partners are studying and modeling, in particular, some of the soil carbon dynamics and the ways that these deep roots can capture carbon dioxide from the air and how that works with carbon cycles. We're also interested in the ways in which these deeply rooted plants can have more efficient nitrogen use. So if you think about being able to use nitrogen fertilizer more efficiently or at decreased rates, that's good for water when you think about decreased runoff. And also it's useful in terms of climate impacts when you think about nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas. And then also these perennial systems might have decreased fossil fuel use in terms of inputs. So thinking about the fossil fuel labor that we use for tillage and for weed management. So these are all things that we are studying, interesting. And these deep roots could also be tools in adapting to climate change. So if you think about scenarios with less frequent but more intense rains, something like increased water infiltration would be important. Or if you think about not having to plant every year because a perennial plant would grow for multiple years, that could be better for establishment because people do not have to take the risk of being dependent upon favorable weather for annual planting and establishment. So just to sum up some of these ecological benefits, this is an image from a 2018 paper about is the future of agriculture perennial, just naming all the ecosystem processes that are enhanced and functioning in natural ecosystems and how those services become disservices when we move to annual systems with low diversity, with exposed soils. We can think about the impact on erosion, but also all sorts of other factors that are important and how moving to more perennial and diverse agricultural systems can help restore some of these services. So we have breeding work and crop improvement and domestication. We have ecology programs and research. We also have a crop stewardship program, which is really about stewarding these perennial grain crops in process from the research station and as they become ready onto the landscape at ultimately a scale that has a positive and timely ecological impact. So here's an image of some of our Kernza growers and partners here in Kansas that was featured in the Washington Post. And this, I think, is really poignant us to a consideration of how we develop and build sustainable supply chains with consideration of who is eating and growing these grains and what it means to be inclusive and sustainable socially as well as ecologically. We have several collaborative grant projects that I wanted to name just because of the ways they integrate research and education. So we're moving sort of into my programmatic realm here, but the ways that it's connected to some of these scientific efforts. The first one is called the Kernza CAP grant, which is about developing Kernza perennial grain. And the second is one pictured at the bottom is the New Roots for Restoration Biology Integration Institute. And in both of these large federally funded grants, we have many institutions and organizations and partners coming together to do research. And the first Kernza CAP to advance the Kernza perennial grain crop enterprise and build a model for future grain crop development. And then in the bottom with New Roots for Restoration, the ecological research is about how plant traits from root to shoot interact with plant communities in the ecosphere. And then they're looking at how that might have implications for restoring both natural and agricultural landscapes. And they're also at the same time building an educational team to educate the next generation of scientists and researchers. So in both of these projects, my educational work is involved with training and mentoring. And in the case of the Kernza CAP, developing a suite of open access educational modules that place Kernza in context, introducing people to this perennial grain crop in the context of communities and agroecosystems and earth systems, and really thinking about how learning means transformative change that's informed by both scientific and social knowledge. So just really recognizing how building awareness and doing that in an informed way and engaging people in both the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and this sort of transdisciplinary effort of community engagement is part of the lens that we bring to these educational modules, which are being developed for high school and undergraduate classrooms. I wanted to share a little bit about the people that I get to work with here at the Land Institute, the staff community. So learning is a social process, and these are some of the people that I get to learn with here in Kansas and around the US, and then also around the world. The photo here is from a global conference the Land Institute held pre-pandemic in Sweden in 2019. And in 2020, the Land Institute received a Food Planet Prize to launch the New Roots International Initiative. So this is about building a global movement as well as a network of localized hubs, this infrastructure for collaboration and that kind of web of roots that we can talk about. So we want to understand how that global network can be engaged with communities in different places and contexts. So here I want to just point to something I've written around the social perennial vision. So how do people think about their contributions to realizing a more just perennial future? And I think here it was where we start to see how agriculture is not just out there on the landscapes we've been looking at, but it's also in here culturally. Our history of agriculture has influenced the systems by which humans relate to each other socially, culturally, economically. And we have to engage that culture and the cultural dimensions if we want to build a society that can realize perennial grains, but also a society that will use them when they're developed. So the question that we've been asking and investigating is, if the ecological future of agriculture is to be perennial and diverse, what's required of us in social terms? So we think about how new social relationships might be possible with new agricultural systems that are perennial and that feature perennial grains, but that's not inevitable. It's not guaranteed that an agriculture that's more ecologically sustainable is more socially just. So how do we understand and analyze the systems of relationships we're in and start to work towards alternatives? And that's where this work of transformation and the process of change becomes really important. So we have a vision of people learning in communities and that learning continuing over time. And we think that the method by which we can accomplish that is to include people not only as end users of future perennial grains, but to involve many people in the work of creating them and the ecosystems in which they live. So that has led to the creation of the Civic Science program, which I organize and facilitate. And in this work, people are actively doing the work of care to build a perennial future by contributing and participating in scientific discovery. So this is a transdisciplinary method in which people receive seeds and seedlings that we send them. They plant them, in this case, at a small scale in their backyards and home gardens and farms. They collect scientific data that's important and useful for us. And also they get to learn in community with other people in a method that connects them across places. So the decentralized approach in which we have plants growing in a lot of places we otherwise couldn't reach, and that data is valuable to us, but also in which we can share our knowledge and resources and provide more access. So we collect data that's both quantitative as well as qualitative. We're interested in the sciences piece and also the stories that emerge from this research. So the possible relationships that can be formed between people and these new perennial plants and their particular places. So this idea of building roots and putting roots in the ground. So this is a perennial wheat project we started last year in which about 100 people around the United States are growing small plots of perennial wheat in their backyards and farms in order to help us actually test its perenniality across many different places. We're excited to see where this wheat line survives for multiple years. And I just wanted to share a little bit of a few quick slides to give you a sense of where those people are located, the range of land relations involved, the different researchers and advisors on the team, and then the types of materials we provide. These are participant civic scientist photos, and we ask different questions about their learning, about their experiences sensory with the plants, and also their scientific observations. We provide context around the plant relationship with people. In the case of wheat, a very particular and long-lived relationship. And we provide timelines and history around that process, in this case, of the pursuit of the perennialization of wheat and the ways in which civic scientists are now joining this long-term human endeavor to create a future perennial wheat crop. So this is a little bit about what's happening right now with our particular perennial wheat cohort, and you can see some of the visual illustrations and timeline that we provide and the types of data that they're collecting. I also wanted to name again, this larger part of the Ecosphere Studies program, which I lead, around the foundational knowledge of this ecospheric context and really recognizing the timeliness of this moment on the planet. So when we're thinking about new stories of human relationship with plants, we're also thinking about new stories of understanding what is enough and what it means to come back down to earth, to live within limits, to be able to form those relationships with other humans in community, with our food systems and with our places. So when we think about addressing the climate emergency, and we think about addressing major social justice issues like white supremacy, and when we think about our vulnerability in terms of public health and politics, I have a colleague, Stan Cox, who has recently been doing some wonderful writing, thinking about the interconnected nature of these crises. His recent book is The Path to a Livable Future, and he's also been writing about this idea of enough and limits. So in the last 5 minutes or so here, I wanted just to end by sharing a little bit of my Silphium story, and offering that as a little bit of a microcosm of what some of our civic scientists might experience, but also as some context, because I think some Silphium Integrifolium seedlings have recently arrived on Transylvania University's campus and will be going in the ground tomorrow. And also because I wanted to share some of my story, because I think that researchers are fundamentally learners. Just like I think about being a teacher as being a learner and a student for life myself, I think about being a researcher, I think about in a transdisciplinary context, I think about continually learning and being willing to do what I would ask anyone I collaborate with or engage with to also do in the sake of learning. So some of my Silphium story actually begins back when I was in graduate school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This is a photo I took of some roots, of me and some roots at one of the herbariums on campus. These really wonderful tangled roots, in this case, little blue stem, Schizachyrium scoparium, which is Nebraska state grass, my favorite. And this image sort of echoes and predates the Land Institute Roots banner that we saw at the beginning. And this is a monolith that's about 4 feet that was prepared by Weaver and Darland. So John Weaver, J.E. Weaver, is kind of a preeminent plant ecologist who worked in Nebraska. And this particular monolith was from 1948, but Weaver is really especially well known for studying prairie plants and how they responded to the Dust Bowl and to conditions of drought. So I was experiencing these little blue stem roots, and when I was in graduate school, I was also, as I mentioned, starting to grapple and begin the lifelong process of kind of recognizing and realizing the absence of these blue stem roots from the places in which I learned and taught at this land-grant university. I was thinking especially about being in the basement classrooms in which I taught and was a student myself, in places that roots like those of these plants were removed to make spaces for human learning for some humans. So one of the plants that Weaver was observing during the Dust Bowl and realizing was this plant, Silphium integrifolium. You might know it as rosinweed. And he was noting that this particular species not only survived, but was able to thrive during drought conditions. And we can see here a contemporary photo from Chris Helzer at the Nature Conservancy of Silphium integrifolium, in which he writes about in a blog post about how this particular plant can still bloom while other vegetation is all brown due to lack of rain. So you can see why. You can see some of those Silphium roots in the image at the right, and their depth and persistence. They're a little bit different root structure than the really fine root structure of the intermediate wheatgrass we saw earlier. They're sort of in 2 parts, deeper, and then also spread out closer to the top. And that they are really deep, that's multiple meters down, and it's really fascinating and important to start to realize. But I didn't realize this plant really existed. I grew up in proximity to it and to this species and many others in the prairie, but I wasn't aware of it until I really met it as an adult when I arrived back at the Land Institute, where it had attracted the attention of our plant breeders. It's a relative of the sunflower family, as you can tell by the blossoms, and it's now being domesticated as a future perennial oilseed crop. So as I started to get to know Silphium, and my understanding of this plant began to shift from an it to an actual creature in my presence, a plant that I live by, who I see on our remnant prairie, as well as in our research plots in very close proximity to each other, I began to collaborate with our Silphium breeder to explore what it would be like to invite others into learning with Silphium into an experimental community. And that was the first pilot project of our civic science effort, in which we invited folks around the United States to observe and grow and care for this plant. We recruited not knowing whether anyone would join us, and we did find people. You can see one of our internal invites in the email at the right, in which we were very clear that people cannot fail. We want to learn what's going wrong, and as David wrote, the Silphium seedlings understand the risk. And this was a true experiment in which we were really learning by doing, and was really gratifying over the course of this 3-year pilot to begin to build these new relationships. So this was a plant that I started to grow in my backyard. I convinced, as you can see in the email here, my mom to sign up and grow this plant on our farm. I started to have more sensory experiences observing this plant year round, being really excited when it comes back up in the spring, seeing all of the bees and moths on it during the summer. And then eventually seeing it being harvested, participating in that, and even last summer having some tasting experiences as we experiment with how Silphium might be used in different food products. It also raised questions to me about access and who has access to understanding Silphium. And what does it mean to create broader and more diverse and inclusive communities of learning in relationship to Silphium? Based upon my interest in ethnobotany, I started realizing some of the documented medicinal uses in the literature, and I'm beginning to develop the plan to respectfully research historical and contemporary indigenous relationships to this native perennial prairie plant. It really helped me to think about why I'm doing this work. You can see some people interacting here with Silphium and some of the community. And I started to think about why I wanted to invest in this effort, and came back to thinking about my kid and introducing him to Silphium and his own awareness of this plant. But really, it was much deeper than that. It was about future generations of many kids, not just my own rootedness in place, but about creating a perennial future in which many people could find that sense of belonging in place in ways that were both ecologically possible and socially good. So when I think about my Silphium story, I also have to connect it with my climate story. And in particular, last December here in Kansas, right in the middle of December 15th, we had a major kind of derecho storm, a day in which we saw blowing dust and dust storms. I was thinking about the Dust Bowl and Weaver. I was thinking about the Silphium in my backyard. We had wildfires and thunderstorms. It was this day that was just incredibly unseasonable and unusual, even for the Great Plains. And that really reconnected with me with that sort of deeper purpose, getting to the root of why I wanted to be engaged in this work and my motivations for persisting in it perennially for multiple years. So as I wrap up, I wanted just to locate us where we are. I saw this graphic just a few days ago. It was designed by Ed Hawkins that positions us in terms of climate, where we are and what possibilities and pathways are available to humans in the ecosphere as we look forward. And I find it really sobering to realize the kind of threshold at which we are. And that to me connects with this idea of what we do when we meet that threshold and what we need to do to be able to cross into a more just and perennial and sustainable future, and the kind of concepts that help us do so. So an idea I've been working with a lot recently is this idea of threshold concepts, which comes from the educational research literature, Meyer and Land's work, who identify threshold concepts as the things that you need to know to enter into a discipline or into a research community. And they write about how threshold concepts are things that transform your understanding. Once you sort of see it, you can't unsee it. They help you integrate things you didn't know were connected before. They're irreversible, you don't go back. And they're also troublesome. They cause you to need to let go of what you thought you knew in order to enter into that new understanding. So I think I want to offer this as just something for all of our reflection about what the kinds of threshold concepts are that might help us, and what the difficulty of naming those threshold concepts and engaging with them, because think that they ask us to realize what's stopping us from kind of crossing over between what we think we know intellectually, rationally, into actually embodying that knowledge. That gap between kind of learning intellectually and then actually doing, in terms of learning as change behavior or action. So realizing that this work of realizing roots involves letting go of grief, of some cases dissolution of the idea of being a separate self, and instead calls us forward with courage and humility, has been important, and I wanted to share that tonight. Some of the threshold concepts that have been important for me that I continue to work with are named here: perenniality as a threshold concept, land, ecosphere, the land relationships we have, the prairie, the idea of limits as something that we really have to grasp in a way we haven't before, and this also the work of care, which I've spent some time writing about. And in all these cases, I just wanted to name the repetition of this work and the kind of practice aspect of it. So roots grow, but they also turn over and die back. And that's how nutrients and other things get cycled through. And we think about soil not as a static thing, but as a living community that's connected with all these other aspects of the ecosphere. So when I think about what needs to be done to engage with threshold concepts, I don't think it's a one-time step over and we're there. And that's certainly not how we're going to be able to think about perennial ag and culture in the context of climate change. Instead, I think we have to have this emphasis on the commitment to a practice of transformation, of repetition, of labor, of trying over and over, and finding our practices that can be sustained in the work of creating the perennial future together. So there's a groundswell of movements and important work to be done, and everyone has gifts to give, and we need each other in this work. So I'll end just by saying, here's a citation slide. These are some of the things I've written and contributed to that I've been speaking from as I describe this work tonight, ranging from a video series to essays to scientific publications. And if you look in any of the bibliographies of these pieces and you think about the images of people and plants you've seen tonight, you'll know some of my teachers, for which I'm very grateful. And I'm also grateful to all of you. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. And I hope when you look at this image, you see, if your screen allows you to see that person in the crowd at Prairie Festival who's wearing a root down t-shirt and who's looking down at the ground, which is that below ground that I want to call us back to. So when you see this image and when you think about this talk, you think about what is under land and the ways in which we are connected and rooted and the ways in which we can be as we move together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. That is so many things that my notebook here is full. My head is overflowing. There's you can put a lot into a small space of time. So thank you for all of that. And we'll have to continue kind of cycling through that tomorrow when we talk as a class and hopefully it'll be fun. But thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I want to remind those who are here that you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A and that use that instead of the chat, because that's the place where we can sort of share them and see them. And I'll feel free to start typing things anytime, and I'll just launch us with a couple of questions. So as you mentioned, our class is actually very pleased and honored to begin participating in one of your civic science projects that on Silphium. And so we got to see a little bit more about the plant today. But one of my students, Ainsley, and I were unpacking them and, checking them to see how moist they were and touching them and feeling them. And we noticed that the leaves themselves are very, well, we called it like a cat's tongue. They're very, they had this really amazing texture, and it was a little startling because it didn't look like it was going to feel that way. But when you showed the slide of them blooming when everything else was dry, I thought, maybe that was a useful observation. Maybe that's another way they hold on to dew, perhaps. Like I live near the Kentucky River, and sometimes when it doesn't rain, they say some crops do better near the river because we have this incredible morning fog
Hmm.
off the river. So, but which plants can catch the fog? And so that just made me wonder about the types of observations you train yourselves or your other civic science participants to make. Like, are things like noticing the texture or the smell or the resinous quality, like, are those sorts of things useful in your work as a researcher and your team of researchers?
Yeah, well, it's great that you're already making observations. I love to see civic scientists in action. And you're right that that texture is really unforgettable. And it's kind of common across plants in the Silphium genus. If you have interacted with like compass plant before, or another plant in the Silphium genus, is common name is cup plant. And the sort of the way that those leaves attach to the stem does leave a cup that which actually will collect water. So I'm not sure if it has to do, the leaf texture has to do with collecting dew, or whether it's just more general in terms of like protecting against moisture loss, and sort of resilience in that way. But it would be interesting to find out. In
Yeah.
our civic science, and I'm sure my colleagues here, if they were here, would chime in with the right answers. But one of the things that we try to do in our civic science projects is to be really clear about a kind of baseline core question that we have people, that's really essential for us to understand. So in the case of, for instance, the perennial wheat project I mentioned earlier, we have kind of core questions around perenniality. We really want people to tell us whether the plants come back after the winter, the regrowth, and whether they regrow after harvest. That's really important. We have a core question around disease. So we're really interested in a kind of sample around that and observations if people are seeing rest. And then we have a core question around community learning. So we do kind of learning surveys connected to that. But then we layer on a whole bunch of optional things, so that people who are busy can do the baseline and be really successful, but people who have the interest and inclination can go deeper. And in that case, we are really interested in all kinds of sensory observations, as well as kind of cultural and social things. We love to hear stories of people's own insights, as well as the conversations they have with other people about their plots. So some folks, grow in a community garden, and we normally have signage up with things, and people have really great conversations. And so that's also part of the kind of social learning. We do know that in terms of people's motivations, those direct hands-on sensory experiences over long periods of time are really motivating to people. So I think that being able to form that connection firsthand and share those observations, we never know what things that might connect with. And certainly our plant breeders, who are spending a lot of time intimately observing plants, are very interested in those kinds of characteristics about leaf shape and size, in terms of height, and resin quality is really interesting. All these things that we think about the kind of plant breeder's eye on a plant, people are interested in knowing about. So
Yeah, our class, it's we've taken some field trips, and mostly to places that are more native species, old Kentucky woodlands, and we were just at a spot that had a mix of sort of savanna and woodlands. But the experts there talked a lot about pollinators, and we've been thinking about pollinators as well. And one bit of, I thought, startling, maybe almost threshold level concept was that the blooms of the plants actually match the structures of the blooms match the structures of the pollinators as the spring moves. So they start like little small flies that don't have much of a proboscis, and this open simple plants, and then they get more complex. But as we think about things that aren't, I mean, that just blew all of our minds. We stood there and went, what? It was amazing. So we've been looking at pollinators too. So here's this plant, it comes from Kansas. I don't know if it's ever been native in Kentucky. We're hoping to save seed from it. Can we do such a thing? Are there pollinators around that can take care of the Silphium with us? I mean, I like that language of the working together with the pollinators. We've sort of come to this realization. It takes a team of more than one species.
Yeah, so Silphium Integrifolium has a pretty wide native range, and genetically, in terms of the plant's evolutionary history, there's some recent evidence that suggests it might have an origin in the Southeast. So we know that it's broadly engaged with a lot of different pollinator communities here, and what we've observed and studied and what our partners have been working on. So I would expect it would be interesting to understand what native pollinators, as well as if you have honeybees locally, how they're engaging with Silphium. And that's something we've had civic scientists do, which I don't think will be part of the baseline for your project, but it's certainly available. And we have resources available around how to do basic pollinator observations and sort of some of the different families. And we're interested in developing more resources, especially around all the families of native bees. So stay tuned in the coming years. Yeah.
That is great. So one more question before we go to audience questions. We, in one of the readings that my class and I have done of yours about care work, I guess a couple of questions. One is, you mentioned, let me pull up this quote. You talk about the fact that care is actually work and requires skill and effort. And one of my questions is, thinking about what you've just shown us, like, how do we build the skills we need to be effective at giving care as we become more aware of our the equity of our food sources and all of the things you were just talking about? How can we skills?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I mean, some of these skills of care are enculturated, especially along gender lines. So, in the care work essay and elsewhere, I've written about, what it like to grow up being taught to how to do the dishes and clean up the house and knit and just all these, and take care of kids. And those are things that were part of, sort of my cultural training. So I gained some skills that were handed down in that way. But so many of the skills of care work, especially caring for the more than human world, have been disrupted in terms of lineages and need to be recovered or relearned. And those might come from within generations we still have access to right now. And there's also, I think it's a larger movement around many people engaged in relearning those skills, domestic and practical, in all sorts of ways. And so I think that sort of learning mindset is available to all of us, and to have some of the humility to take instruction, whether that's from an older person in your life or from your kid who knows something that you don't, which is true in my family, or whether that's from a YouTube video. I think that there's lots of ways that we can learn and practice and develop those kind of new habits.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. A question from the audience, Daniel Clausen, someone you know.
Hi.
He says, so humbling and inspiring, Aubrey. Do you have any more suggested reading on these perennial ag, on this perennial ag culture in story form? Any cli-fi utopias using this idea that you know of, old or new, or in other categories I would add?
Well, we might have to do some writing, Daniel, to get us there. One book that does come to mind is Eric Holthouse's book from a year or two ago called The Future Earth, which I might have on my shelf behind me, but in which Eric is a meteorologist, and we had some conversation when he was writing the book, and he was sort of thinking about what does a better world look like, and sort of actually telling that story and imagining it. And that does include, some thinking about perennial community in one piece of it, and sort of set along different timelines. So that might be a recommended read, but I'm sure I can think of others with some more time, and I'd love to hear your recommendations, or like I said, maybe it's to be written.
Great, thank you. I already looked at Daniel for recommendations, so. Yeah, I'm looking to see if there are any other questions here from the audience. I have a sort of a question of our moment and about care work again. And I'm wondering if you think that the pandemic has changed the way our culture places value on care
Mm.
work. Obviously, it's not about perennial crops specifically, but I just wondered if you were seeing any kind of shift in through your lens of this concept of care work.
Oh, definitely. I mean, when I wrote the Ecosphere care work essay, it was published right at the beginning of 2020. Of all times. And when I was writing and researching this idea of care work, I was already seeing, I was amazed to understand how, folks like feminist economists had been writing about this for decades. And I hadn't been aware of it. And also seeing how these ideas of care, including the shadow side of care around control, were already coming up in the literature, like Maria Bellacosta's work and others. And so I think it had already sort of a resurgence of attention. And then over the last 2 years, I've seen so much work come out around essential labor, around the sort of exacerbation of exactly how essential care work is, and exactly how our society, our dominant US society, doesn't value it. Even if it's made more visible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being skillfully shared or fairly shared, or equitably compensated. And so I think that there is heightened awareness of that. And there's lots of efforts around thinking about how care can be rewarded, and groups pursuing this. And so I think it's been good to see that awareness, but certainly it feels more pressing than ever, especially as we think about this type of work being just fundamental to the sort of sustaining of human societies. It's work that's always going to have to be done. We're not going to get done with it. So we should probably learn from the traditions of people who have been trying to learn how to value and share it for a long time already.
Great. Yeah, beautifully said. One final question that's more connected with perennial crops.
Sure.
I was wondering if you had any examples of, contemporary examples of successful perennial crops that are, feeding people in some area, or that are either new, like the ones you're working with at the Land Institute, or that have persisted in some way.
Yeah, so perennial grain crops, not as many of those, although I am interested in examples and in across different contexts of grains that, or plants that were used as grains that are perennial. And I think there could be some, and like I said, interested in that. When I think about perennial crops that have persisted for a very long time, I have to think about the examples of tree crops, which, here on the prairie, our trees are certainly here. We can think about different berry bushes as well as some really beautiful trees. But when we think about tree crops, some of the foundational work around thinking around perennial agriculture comes from a book of that name, Tree Crops. And there are certainly so many human cultures who have longstanding relationships with trees. And one that comes to mind, just from a group that we partner and collaborate with in Palestine and the West Bank, is olives. So if you think about human relationships to olive trees, and the persistence of that relationship, and the way that the olive forms part of the heart of that cropping system in one of the landscapes that gave rise to grain agriculture. That certainly, I think, is an example when we think about what it means to create perennial cultures of food.
Yeah, great. Well, just like I said, so many so many things are springing forward from this from your presentation and talk tonight. So thank you so much. I'm trying to be mindful of our time. It is 8 o'clock here Eastern time, and I appreciate you spending this hour with us, and I know that the audience does too. And just checking to see that we haven't missed anyone's questions. We are good. And thank you so much. My class, I know, is very much looking forward to talking with you tomorrow, and I'll share some of your articles out with the rest of the Transylvania community as well. and hopefully we'll get you here in person in the coming year or so. So thank you so much, Aubrey, and thanks to all of you for coming this evening.
It's really my pleasure. Thanks for the time together. I look forward to more soon and to hopefully visiting in the future too. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. Good night. Good night, everyone.